There's a version of American economic history they teach in schools. It's clean, it's linear. It goes something like this. We were chaotic, we were disorganized, we had too many currencies, too many competing interests. And then wise men in Washington brought order, federal order, standardized money, progress. That's the version. But the deeper I looked into the financial legislation of the 1860s and 1870s, the more I kept running into the same unsettling details. The National Banking Acts taxed locally issued currency out of existence quietly until it was no longer viable. The Coinage Act of 1873 removed silver from legal tender in legislation so dense and technical that congressmen later admitted they hadn't understood what they'd voted for. And both acts together ensured that going forward, the only money Americans could legally use was money created through and owed back to centralized banking institutions, currency backed not by land, not by grain, not by anything a working person actually produced, but by government debt and bank credit. Okay, maybe that's just America, maybe that's just coincidence. But then Britain does it in 1844, Germany follows in 1875, Canada restructures in 1871. Japan models its entire banking system on the American Acts in 1872. Australia centralizes by 1878. France tightens the Banque de France's monopoly through the same decade. All of them, same window, same solution, same result, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let me tell you what actually existed in America before 1863. Before the National Banking Acts, the United States operated under what historians blandly call a free banking era, from roughly 1837 to 1863. And the name, I think, is misleading, because what it describes wasn't chaos. It was something far more interesting. It was locality. Individual states chartered their own banks. Those banks issued their own currency. And here is the part that matters most, the part that gets glossed over in every standard economic textbook. Much of that currency was backed by something real: land, commodities, warehouse receipts, agricultural assets, actual tangible wealth that existed in the physical world. A farmer in Ohio could walk into a locally chartered bank, present his land deed or his stored grain, and receive currency reflecting the value of that asset. He wasn't borrowing from a distant institution. He was, in a very real sense, monetizing his own productive capacity. This raises a simple but critical question. If the system was so chaotic, so dangerous, why did commerce flourish? Why did towns grow? Why did roads get built, granaries get filled, small industries take root, all without a centralized federal monetary authority telling anyone what their money was worth? The official explanation is that the system was fraudulent. Wildcat banking, they called it, banks issuing more notes than they could redeem, banks appearing in the wilderness and disappearing overnight. And yes, that happened. I'm not pretending it didn't. But here's the strangest part when you look at the actual banking failure rates, when you look at the states with the most robust land-backed currency systems, states like New York, Louisiana, Indiana, the record is considerably more stable than the official narrative suggests. Louisiana's banking system in particular, backed by a combination of specie and commercial assets, survived financial panics that crushed institutions in other states. Not weaker, not more chaotic, more resilient. So why don't we talk about that? The deeper I went into the pre-Civil War monetary record, the more I noticed something strange. Something that doesn't fit the narrative of inevitable necessary reform. What I found was a system. Messy, yes, imperfect, certainly. But a system in which financial power was distributed, in which a citizen's relationship to money was mediated not by a distant authority, but by institutions they could, in principle, walk into, argue with, hold accountable. And then, 1863, 1864, 1873, 3 pieces of legislation, 3 quiet earthquakes. The National Banking Act of 1863, refined and strengthened in 1864, did several things that sound administrative and dry until you look at them carefully. It created a system of nationally chartered banks. These national banks could issue standardized currency, national banknotes, but only if they purchased United States government bonds and deposited them with the federal comptroller of the currency. The currency they then issued was backed not by local assets, not by land or grain or physical productive wealth, but by government debt. The backing shifted from productive assets to government obligations, from things that existed in the physical world to promises made by the state. And the state then taxed the old currency out of existence. A 10% tax was levied on state banknotes, not prohibited outright, not declared illegal by fiat, just taxed, incrementally, relentlessly, until it was no longer economically viable to issue them. This raises a simple but critical question. Why tax rather than ban? If the old currency was genuinely dangerous, if it was truly fraudulent and chaotic, why not simply outlaw it? Why use the slower, quieter mechanism of taxation to achieve what could have been done by direct prohibition? The answer, I think, may be in what the slower mechanism conceals. A ban is visible. A ban generates resistance. A ban leaves a clear historical record of what was lost and why. But a tax looks like fiscal policy. It looks like economic management. It looks like the ordinary business of governance. Not a prohibition, not a seizure, not a declaration of war on local monetary sovereignty. Just a tax, just paperwork. And that's where the national banking acts become impossible to ignore. Now we come to 1873, the Coinage Act, an act that even some contemporaries instead called the Crime of 73. The Coinage Act reorganized US coinage, and in doing so quietly omitted the standard silver dollar from the list of coins to be minted. Silver had been a legal tender metal since the founding of the Republic, since 1792. For 81 years, silver was money, standard, constitutional, real. And then, in a piece of legislation so dense, so technical, so deliberately difficult to pass that many of the congressmen who voted for it later claimed they hadn't understood what it contained, silver was gone. Here's the strangest part. The omission wasn't announced, it wasn't debated openly. It was buried, tucked into the technical specifications of coinage weights and compositions, where only those with specific expertise or specific foreknowledge would recognize what was happening. This raises a simple but critical question. Who benefits from the demonetization of silver? Silver was abundant in the American West. Silver was accessible. Silver was decentralized. You could mine it, refine it, bring it to the mint. It was a commodity with intrinsic value that existed independently of any bank's balance sheet, any government's bond issuance, any centralized institution's decision to extend or withhold credit. Gold, by contrast, was scarce, concentrated, held in large quantities by a very small number of institutions and individuals. Fixing the monetary system to gold alone, the effect of the 1873 Act, meant fixing it to something only a few could control. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. First, tax away the locally issued currency. Then, remove the accessible commodity metal from legal tender. Then standardize around the remaining assets, government bonds, gold that happen to be concentrated in the fewest hands. Not reform, not simplification, not modernization, consolidation. I want to stop here and ask you something. What if this wasn't only an American story? Because the deeper I went into the monetary history of other industrializing nations in the same period, the 1860s through the 1880s, the more the pattern repeated. With unsettling precision, Britain had already largely centralized monetary authority through the Bank Charter Act of 1844, which gave the Bank of England monopoly control over note issuance and tied the currency to gold. Before that act, private banks throughout England and Scotland issued their own notes, backed by their own assets, accountable to their own local communities. After 1844, one bank, one note, one standard. And that standard backed by what the central institution held, not what local communities produced. Canada. The Dominion Notes Act of 1868 and the subsequent banking legislation of the 1870s moved aggressively toward federal control of currency issuance, restricting the ability of provincial and private institutions to issue competing notes. Germany. The Reichsbank was established in 1876, consolidating currency issuance from dozens of state banks into a single national institution following German unification. Japan. The National Bank Act of 1872, modelled explicitly, and I do mean explicitly, on the American National Banking Act of 1864, created a centralized system replacing the chaotic but locally grounded monetary arrangements of the feudal period. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision, country after country, decade after decade, as if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand, or perhaps instructions they understood very well. Within roughly a 30-year window, 1844 to 1876, nearly every major industrializing economy on Earth transitioned from distributed, locally issued, asset-backed currency systems to centralized, institutionally controlled, debt-backed monetary frameworks. The timing is not accidental. It cannot be accidental. The coordination required across sovereign nations, across competing political systems, across different legal traditions and cultural contexts, the coordination required for this to be coincidental is simply not available to probability. This is where the official explanation collapses. The official story is that each nation independently, rationally, pragmatically decided to modernize its monetary system. That each set of legislators looked at their own chaotic local situation and concluded that centralization was the answer. But the simultaneity, the uniformity of the solution, the identical mechanism tax, regulate, and ultimately eliminate the competing local currency applied across jurisdictions with no formal coordination mechanism. That's the anomaly. That's where I keep getting stuck. Let me be precise about what this transition created. Not what critics claim, not what partisans assert, what the structural mechanics of the new system actually produced. Under locally issued, asset-backed currency, the creation of money was tied to the creation of value. A farmer who grew wheat, stored it, and obtained a warehouse receipt that functioned as currency, that farmer had expanded the money supply in proportion to real productive output. The money existed because the wheat existed. No intermediary was required to determine whether the wheat was real. The wheat was real. Under the new system, government bond-backed national currency, gold standard, centralized issuance, money entered circulation through a fundamentally different mechanism. Banks borrowed from central institutions, governments issued bonds, currency was created, not from productive assets, but from credit extended by centralized authorities. And credit, unlike land, unlike grain, unlike stored commodities, must be repaid. With interest. Here's what that means structurally. In the old system, a community that produced value could, within limits, create money reflecting that value. The financial system was downstream of the productive system. Money followed productivity. In the new system, productivity became downstream of finance. You could not build, plant, mine, or manufacture without first obtaining credit from an institution that determined whether you were creditworthy. The institution didn't follow the economy followed the institution. This raises a simple but critical question. If your money comes from debt, if every dollar in circulation represents an obligation to a lending institution, then is it possible to ever collectively pay off that debt? If the money to pay the interest was itself created as debt, where does the interest come from? The answer, mathematically, structurally, is that it can't, not in aggregate. Some individual borrowers pay off their debts, but the system as a whole, the total stock of debt-backed money, must perpetually expand to service itself. More debt to pay the interest on existing debt. More credit extended. More dependency deepened. This is not a fringe observation. This is arithmetic, and that arithmetic, that structural dependency, is what the Coinage Act of 1873, the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864, and their equivalents around the world quietly, technically, bureaucratically installed. Not with guns, not with declarations, with coinage weights and bond collateral requirements and a 10% tax. When I started looking for the physical record of what was lost, not the theoretical record, but the tangible surviving evidence of how locally issued currency systems actually functioned, I kept running into the same problem. The records are thin, not entirely absent, not completely erased, but thin in a way that seems disproportionate to the scale of what existed. For a period spanning nearly 3 decades of active, widespread local banking, thousands of chartered state institutions, millions of individual notes in circulation, the surviving documentation is remarkably sparse. Some of what we have, the notes themselves, those that survive in private collections and museum archives, the designs are extraordinary. An 1850s Ohio banknote bearing an engraving of a canal lock and a local landmark, a Wisconsin note depicting a farmer with a plough, a Louisiana note incorporating both English and French text. These weren't just money, they were community artifacts. They bore the identity of the places that issued them, and then they were taxed out of existence, and most of them were destroyed, not archived, not preserved in federal vaults as historical records, destroyed because a cancelled withdrawn banknote had no value. It was paper, it was waste. And so the physical record of what local monetary sovereignty looked like, what it felt like to hold in your hand money that bore the name of your community and the assets of your neighbours, that record was burned. The silence was deafening. I've spent time with local historical societies in Ohio, in Indiana, in rural Georgia. The banking records from the free banking era, the ledgers, the correspondence, the records of what was used as collateral, what assets backed, what notes, they're patchy, fragmentary, inconsistent. Not because the record keeping was poor. By all accounts, many of these institutions maintain meticulous books. But the books didn't survive. The transition periods are documented. The establishment of national bank charters is documented. What came before? Fragments, as if the paper trail, like the currency itself, was quietly, persistently allowed to disappear. I keep coming back to the coordination problem because it's the anomaly I can't explain away. 30 years. Dozens of sovereign nations, the same solution applied to the same problem, too much local monetary autonomy, with the same structural result: centralized control, debt-backed currency, dependency on institutional credit. No international treaty mandated this. No global authority existed to coordinate it. The nations involved were, in many cases, competitive rivals: Britain and Germany, the United States and Britain, Japan positioning itself against Western powers. They had every incentive to diverge, to differentiate, to experiment, and yet the pattern repeats. With unsettling precision, the evidence suggests something much larger than a series of independent, rational decisions. It suggests the possibility of a shared framework, a common set of ideas circulating among the economic and political elites of industrializing nations, ideas about what money should be, who should control it, and how that control should be institutionalized. We know those networks existed. The correspondence between American Treasury officials and their British counterparts in the 1860s. The explicit modelling of Japanese banking legislation on American precedents. The influence of German monetary thinking on American institutional design. The networks were real. The communication was real. What remains unclear, what the historical record cannot quite resolve, or perhaps will not quite resolve, is whether what circulated through those networks was merely knowledge or something closer to instruction. Were these legislators and financiers independently reaching similar conclusions from similar premises? Or were they receiving, through channels we cannot fully document, something more like a blueprint? I'm not going to tell you which, I don't know which, and I'm suspicious of anyone who claims to. But the question I cannot stop asking, deserves to be asked. What strikes me most in the end is not the legislation, not the technical mechanisms, not even the structural consequences, as profound as those are. What strikes me is the silence. The transition from distributed, locally rooted, asset-backed monetary systems to centralized, debt-backed, institutionally controlled currency was, in objective terms, one of the most significant reorganizations of economic power in human history. It fundamentally altered the relationship between ordinary people and the institutions that governed their financial lives. It shifted the locus of monetary creation from community to institution, from productivity to credit, from the tangible to the obligatory. And it happened with almost no public debate about what was actually at stake. There were critics. The free silver movement in the 1870s and 1880s understood, at least intuitively, that something fundamental had been taken. The Greenback Labour Party understood. The agrarian populists who followed understood. William Jennings Bryan, standing before the 1896 Democratic Convention, didn't choose the metaphor of crucifixion on a cross of gold by accident. He knew or sensed that something had been killed. But the debate, when it happened, was framed in technical terms: sound money versus cheap money, gold versus silver, inflation versus deflation. The deeper question, who controls the creation of money and on what basis, and to whose benefit, that question never quite made it to the centre of public discourse. It was framed out, technically, deliberately. I can't prove deliberately, but the framing served certain interests with uncanny consistency. The deeper I went, the more that consistency became impossible to ignore. Within 20 years of the National Banking Acts, by the 1880s, the agricultural regions of America were experiencing a credit crisis. Farmers who had operated, however imperfectly, within a locally mediated financial system found themselves dependent on distant banks for seasonal credit. That credit came with terms they didn't set, interest rates they couldn't negotiate, and collateral requirements that increasingly meant their land. The foreclosure wave of the late 19th century, which drove the agrarian political movements, which produced the Populist Party, which generated decades of rural political fury, that wave was not simply the result of bad harvests or falling commodity prices, though those contributed. It was, structurally, the result of the transition, the result of a system in which the money supply was controlled by centralized institutions whose incentives were not aligned with agricultural productivity, whose credit allocation decisions were made in eastern cities, whose bond collateral requirements meant that currency availability tracked government debt rather than seasonal agricultural need. Not the weather, not individual improvidence, not market forces operating in some neutral, invisible way, the structure, the deliberately, legislatively constructed structure. And that structure persists. The mechanisms have changed, the names have changed, the institutional sophistication has evolved enormously. But the fundamental relationship in which currency is created through institutional credit extension, rather than through productive asset backing, in which the money supply is managed by centralized authorities whose decisions cascade down to ordinary economic lives. That relationship was installed in the 1860s and the 1870s, and the communities that understood money differently, that had built systems, however imperfect, in which a citizen's productive assets had monetary standing, those communities and their financial memory were quietly erased. I want to close with a question, not an answer. I don't have an answer. I'm not sure an answer is available. The question is this: what would money look like if it had gone differently? What if the 1863 and 1864 Banking Acts had preserved some meaningful space for locally issued, productively backed currency alongside the national system? What if the Coinage Act of 1873 had maintained silver's monetary standing, maintaining a metal accessible enough to serve rural and working communities? What if the global consolidation of monetary authority in the 1840s through 1870s had been contested more successfully, had been slowed, had been partially reversed? Would the system be more fragile? Perhaps. Probably. Local currency systems carry real risks. I've acknowledged that throughout. I'm not romanticizing the free banking era. There was fraud, there was failure, there were wildcat banks and worthless notes and genuine harm, but would there also be something preserved that was lost? Some meaningful connection between productive capacity and monetary standing? Some check on the indefinite expansion of debt? Some institutional memory that money need not always, inevitably, structurally, be an obligation? The evidence suggests we lost something when those notes were cancelled and burned, not just an economic mechanism, something closer to a principle. The principle that a community's productive wealth is itself a form of monetary foundation, that the farmer's stored grain, the builder's finished structure, the craftsman's finished goods, that these are not merely commodities awaiting monetization by institutional grace, but are themselves intrinsically expressions of the value that money is supposed to represent. That principle was taxed out of existence, legislated out of existence, and then mostly forgotten. The deeper I went into this story, the more I kept returning to that single image, the cancelled note, the red stamp, the finality of it. Someone somewhere held that note, maybe a farmer, maybe a merchant, maybe a labourer who had earned it through genuine work, and then was told it was no longer valid, was no longer money, was no longer anything. And what replaced it was a note backed not by his productivity, but by a government bond, not by what he built, but by what the state owed, not by his past labour, but by a future obligation. Was that a better system? Was it inevitable? Was it the only possible path from the chaotic monetary landscape of the early republic to the industrial economy of the 20th century? Or was it a choice, made by specific people in specific rooms for specific reasons, that remade the financial relationship between citizens and institutions in ways that still govern our lives today? I keep asking. The silence, as always, is deafening.